She burned the only thing that could destroy her a debt notice worth $800 on a frozen train platform before sunrise. She had $14, a pocket revolver, and one address written in a stranger's handwriting. The man at the end of that address had turned away 7 women before her. He opened the door and said one word, "No." She put her boot in the gap and said, "I need to disappear for a winter." Something in those 5 words made him step aside. What happened on that mountain over the next 5 months was not a love story. Not at first. First, it was survival. Then it was something that survival cannot fully explain. Stay with me, because this story does not end where you think it ends. This channel is home to stories from the wild American West tales of love tested by hard country, of mothers who refused to be broken, of strangers who became family in the places where the world asked everything and gave nothing back easily. If those are the stories that move you, you are exactly where you belong. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stop running long enough to find out what they were running toward. If this story is speaking to you already, hit that like button right now. It tells me you want more stories like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me, would you have put your boot in that door? Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you are new here, subscribe and ring the bell. New stories go up every week, and you do not want to miss what is coming next.
The debt notice was 8 inches long and 4 inches wide, and it had ruined my life in the particular way that paper sometimes does. Quietly, without ceremony, on a Tuesday morning in November while the coffee was still hot, and the kitchen smelled like wood smoke and the last of the season's apples. And I sat at the table in the house I had shared with Thomas Callahan for 4 years, and read the number at the bottom of the page, and understood that everything I had been afraid of had finally arrived. $800. Thomas Callahan, deceased. Eleanor Callahan, widow, liable under Montana Territory succession law. I read it 3 times. The number did not change. Numbers rarely do, which is one of the things that makes them both useful and terrible depending on which side of them you happen to be standing on. I folded the paper and put it in my coat pocket and sat for a while longer with my coffee, watching the light come up over the eastern hills through the kitchen window. It was the kind of November morning that Montana does better than anywhere I have ever been. Cold and clean and so clear that the mountains to the north looked close enough to touch, their peaks already white with the first real snow of the season. I had 2 choices, as far as I could see. I could stay in Billings and wait for Harlan Voss to come back with more men and fewer patients. Or I could go. I had been thinking about going for 8 months. The problem with going is that you need somewhere to go to, and I had spent those 8 months being unable to identify anywhere that would take me, and ask nothing in return except work. I had no family left in Montana. My mother was 10 years dead in County Cork, Ireland, which was also 10 years and an ocean away. My father had followed her into the ground 3 years later, which left me alone in a new country at the age of 15 with nothing but stubbornness and the English language and a determination to make something that was mine. I had made Thomas Callahan instead, which was not quite the same thing, though it had taken me longer than it should have to understand the difference. The morning after Harlan Voss came to my door with the debt notice and the 2 men and the smile, I sat down and wrote a letter to every woman I had known in the past 4 years who might know of honest work. Most did not write back. One did. A woman named Margaret Finney, who had left Billings the previous spring for a town called Copperhead Creek up in the high country north of the Yellowstone Range. Her letter was brief and practical, which was Margaret all over. She said she could not offer me work herself, but that there was a woman in Copperhead Creek who knew everyone and everything and who Margaret trusted completely. Her name was Agnes Whitmore. She ran the Whitmore House Boarding Lodge. She will know who to ask, Margaret wrote. Tell her I sent you. I had been holding that letter for 3 weeks, turning it over in my mind like a coin, looking at both sides. On the morning I burned the debt notice on the Billings Rail Depot platform, I had made my decision. I struck the match on the depot post in the blue-black hour before sunrise, with my one leather traveling bag at my feet, and the wind coming down from the northern ranges like it intended to make a point. I held the flame to the corner of the paper, watched it burn toward my fingers, dropped it when the heat became serious, and watched the last of it curl to ash on the frozen platform boards. Then I took Margaret's letter from my coat pocket, read the address one more time, and stepped onto the northbound stage without looking back at the city that had eaten 5 years of my life and given me precious little in return. My name is Eleanor Callahan. People who know me call me Ellie, though at the time this story begins, there were very few people who knew me at all, which was as close to safety as I had been able to arrange. The stage north took the better part of 8 hours, and I spent most of them watching Montana Territory pass by the frosted window and thinking about Thomas. Not grieving him, I should be honest about that. Whatever grief I might have felt for the man Thomas Callahan had appeared to be in the early years of our marriage had been used up long before his death. What I felt sitting on that northbound stage was something closer to the particular exhaustion that follows a long illness. Not sadness exactly, but a bone-deep relief at its ending, mixed with the residue of 4 years of being afraid, and the complicated guilt of a woman who had known things she had not acted on. Thomas Callahan had been charming the way certain weather is charming. Spectacular to observe, dangerous to be caught in without shelter. I had married him at 21 because he was certain about everything at a time when I was certain about nothing, and I had made the fundamental error of confusing certainty with safety. It is a confusion that costs women considerably more than it costs men, in my experience, but that observation does not do much for a woman who has already made it. He was not a violent man. I want to be accurate about this because accuracy matters, and because I have known violent men, and Thomas was not one of them. What he was dishonest in a way that had roots deeper than I understood when I married him. Not dishonest about small things. Not the ordinary dishonesty of a man who overstates his income or understates his drinking. But fundamentally dishonest in the way a person is when they have decided that the rules which govern other people do not apply to them and never did. He found Harlan Voss, or Voss found him, in the spring of 1876, 3 years after we came to Montana from Wyoming, where Thomas had been running a somewhat different version of the same scheme under a somewhat different name. I did not know this then. I know it now, and the knowing is one of the things I carry. I found out about the Montana operation 8 months before Thomas died. Found the papers in the desk he kept locked. On a morning he had gone out early and left the desk key in his coat pocket instead of on his watch chain where he normally kept it. And I was going through his coat looking for his second pipe because he had asked me to find it. And I found the key, and I found the desk, and I opened it. 11 families. At minimum 11 families across 3 counties who had bought land from Thomas Callahan that was not his to sell, who had paid money they could not afford to lose for deeds that were worth exactly nothing, who were living on ground that could be taken from them at any moment when the right person filed the right paperwork. I sat at that desk for an hour. Then I put everything back exactly as I had found it, locked the desk, put the key back in the coat pocket, and went downstairs and made Thomas his breakfast when he came home. And I smiled at him across the table, and I said nothing. I am not proud of this. But I want you to understand the calculation I was making, which was, I have no money of my own, no family in this territory, no legal standing except as Thomas Callahan's wife, and the law in Billings County is Commissioner Aldrich, and Aldrich is Voss's man, which I had understood for some time without fully understanding what it meant. Running meant nowhere to run to. Staying meant silence. I chose silence, and I have been paying for that choice in the hours between midnight and dawn ever since. Thomas died in October, thrown from a horse on the Yellowstone Road, or so the story went. Voss appeared at my door the following morning with a debt notice, 2 men, and a smile that explained rather more than he probably intended it to. Not just that Thomas owed him $800. I did not believe for a moment that Thomas owed Harlan Voss anything except the continuation of their arrangement, but that the death had been convenient, and the debt was a mechanism, and the mechanism's purpose was to give Voss a legal claim on anything and anyone connected to Thomas Callahan's estate, including his widow, which was me. I had 4 days before Voss moved from threatening to acting. I had $14, a Remington pocket revolver that had been my father's, and an address in Copperhead Creek. It was not much of a hand, but I had never in my life been dealt a good hand, and I had learned early that the cards you are given matter considerably less than what you are willing to do with them. The stage reached Copperhead Creek in the late afternoon, and the town was exactly what the journey had suggested it would be: small, mud-streeted, wind-bitten, occupying a narrow valley at the foot of the ranges with the mountain wall rising behind it to the north like a door half open on something larger. One main road, a farrier at the south end, a dry goods store, a saloon called the Broken Spur with light and noise coming from inside that seemed cheerful in the way that warmth seems cheerful when you have been cold for long enough. At the far north end, a 2-story log building with a painted sign that read Whitmore House, Boarding and Lodging, E. Whitmore Proprietor. Agnes Whitmore was exactly what Margaret's letter had suggested. A woman who had outlasted harder things than most people ever face and had developed, in the process of outlasting them, the particular quality of steadiness that comes not from the absence of trouble, but from having survived enough of it to stop being surprised. She was wiping down the bar when I came in, and she looked me over the way experienced people look at trouble, quickly, completely, without making a production of it. She set down her cloth, poured coffee from the pot on the stove, set it on the bar in front of me. She said, "You are running from a man or the law." I said, "Does it matter which?" She said, "Up here, not particularly. Sit down." I sat. The coffee was strong and hot, and I wrapped my hands around the cup and felt the warmth move up my arms and thought, I will not cry. I have not cried since October, and I am not going to start now in a stranger's boarding lodge. I did not cry. Agnes settled into the chair across from me with the ease of a woman entirely comfortable in her own establishment, and she told me about Cormac Driscoll. He was a former Pinkerton detective who had lived alone on Blackthorn Ridge 5 miles up the mountain north of town for the past 5 years. He was, by Agnes's account, a large and difficult man who had chosen solitude with the deliberateness of someone who had considered the alternative and found it wanting. He needed help through the winter season and had needed it before. 7 women had come up to Blackthorn Ridge since 1875, drawn by the offer of room and board in exchange for labor, and not one of them had lasted a full month. Agnes told me about 2 of them because she was an honest woman and she believed I should know what I was considering. The first woman had lasted 9 days. She had come back down the mountain crying and told Agnes that Driscoll had not spoken a word to her the entire time that was not a direct order. Agnes said, "I do not blame her. 9 days of that would wear anyone down." The third woman had been tougher. A rancher's widow from Missoula who had come to Copperhead Creek after losing her land to a bank foreclosure, and who had, by all accounts, considerable experience with hard work and difficult circumstances. She had lasted 3 weeks. She left after Driscoll told her she had stacked the firewood incorrectly and then walked away before she could respond. She told Agnes it was not the words. It was the way he looked at her when he said them. Like she was already gone. Like he was just waiting for the departure he had already scheduled. Agnes put her hands flat on the table between us. "He is not cruel, Ellie. He's just used up. There is a difference between those 2 things, and I want you to understand the difference before you decide anything. But I also want you to understand that used-up men can wear a person down just as surely as cruel ones, and sometimes the wearing is harder to see coming." I asked her for directions. She gave them without argument, which told me something about Agnes Whitmore, that she was the kind of woman who believed in other women's right to make their own calculations and live with them. Then she wrapped 2 biscuits in a cloth and tucked them in my bag. I rented a bay mare from the farrier at first light the following morning. Old but sure-footed, with the calm authority of an animal that has done difficult things before and has opinions about them. The switchback trail up to Blackthorn Ridge was a foot deep in fresh snow, and the mountains above were still in shadow when I started up. the trail barely visible between the dark columns of the spruce and pine, the air so cold it had weight to it, the kind of cold that makes itself known in the lungs before it makes itself known anywhere else. I thought, on that climb, about the 7 women who had ridden up this same trail and then come back down. I thought about what Agnes had said. Used up, not cruel. I thought there was probably not as much practical difference between those 2 states as Agnes wanted to believe, but I also thought that I had nowhere else to go, and that sometimes the direction you travel is determined less by choice than by the simple fact of having run out of road. The mare picked her way through the snow with the kind of quiet efficiency that I was beginning to aspire to myself. The cabin appeared at dusk through the timber. Stone foundation, log walls chinked with gray clay, a stone chimney with a thin line of smoke rising perfectly straight in the still air. One window lit orange gold from inside. It looked solid. It looked like it had been built by someone who intended it to last, which was not a quality I had encountered often enough in the structures people had asked me to inhabit. I had not realized, until I saw that lit window through the trees, how profoundly cold I had been. Not just the November cold, which was real enough, but the other kind. I rode into the clearing, dismounted, tied the mare to the post by the door, and raised my hand to knock. The door opened before my knuckles touched the wood. He had heard the mare on the trail 20 minutes before I reached the clearing. This was the first thing I understood about Cormac Driscoll, that he paid attention to everything, always, not as a social exercise or a performance of vigilance, but as a fundamental orientation toward the world, the way some people breathe without thinking about it. He had heard a horse he did not recognize on a trail that led only to his cabin, and he had registered the sound and tracked its progress and been standing at the door when I arrived, because a man who lives alone on a mountain in Montana Territory in November and does not do these things is a man who does not live alone on a mountain for very long. He stood in the doorway, and I took inventory the way you do when you need information quickly and cannot afford to miss anything. Tall, well over 6 feet, wide across the shoulders in the way of a man who works with his body rather than in spite of it, dark hair gone slightly long at the collar, 4 or 5 days of beard on a face that had been made for harder weather than most people ever see. He was perhaps 38 years old, perhaps 40. It was difficult to say because his face had the quality that certain outdoor lives produce, where the surface tells you about the conditions and not much about the years. His eyes were gray-green, the color of a forest in November, which is to say, very still, and full of things that did not announce themselves. He looked at me for approximately 3 seconds. The assessment was complete, and I knew it, even if I did not yet know what it had concluded. He said, "No." I said, "I have not asked anything yet." And he said, "Agnes sent you." I said, "Agnes gave me directions. I made the decision." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth. I would not have recognized warmth from him for another 2 months at least. But a small recalibration, as if the answer had registered as something slightly different from what he had expected. He said, "You have 20 words. Use them." I thought for 1 second, and then I used 11 of them. I work hard. I do not complain. And I need to disappear for a winter. The last 4 were the ones that got me through the door. The cabin was a single large room with a stone fireplace against the north wall, a plank table in the center, shelves along the east wall stacked with supplies, in an arrangement that was clearly organized by a system I did not yet know. A workbench ran along the far wall with tools hanging above it in order of size, each on its own peg, each clean. A cast-iron stove near the workbench. A ladder in the south corner leading up to a sleeping loft. Everything had a place and was in it. This was the cabin of a man who had made peace with solitude by making it orderly, which is one of the things people do when they have decided that the only reliable constants in their life are the ones they can control directly. Driscoll went to the stove without speaking, ladled stew from the iron pot into a bowl, and set it on the table. He said, "Eat. Loft is up the ladder. Blankets in the chest." He did not ask if I was hungry. He had looked at me and known. I sat down and ate. The stew was elk meat and root vegetables, under-seasoned, but it was hot, and I had been cold for the better part of 10 hours, and hot food is its own argument when you have been cold long enough. I ate without speaking because he was not speaking, and because I had learned in 4 years with Thomas Callahan that silence at a table was not necessarily hostility. Sometimes it was simply two people in the same room doing what they needed to do without requiring the other person's narration of it. He moved through the cabin while I ate, performing small maintenance tasks with the automatic efficiency of a man who has done them so many times they no longer require thought. Adding wood to the stove, checking a window latch, running a whetstone along a skinning knife with the steady, meditative rhythm of a man doing something his hands know better than his mind does. He did not look at me. He was not ignoring me exactly. It was more that I had not yet become relevant to whatever internal accounting he was conducting, and he was not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of social form. I respected this more than I expected to. I washed my bowl in the bucket by the door when I finished because it was the obvious thing to do, and I was not going to be the person who left her dishes for someone else. Then I climbed the ladder to the loft. The sleeping loft ran the full width of the cabin, low-ceilinged with a narrow window at the north end that looked out at the mountain above. A thin mattress covered most of the floor space. A canvas curtain on a rope divided the loft roughly in half. This, I would learn later, had been strung on my second night by Driscoll without explanation or discussion, which I took as a practical acknowledgement that two people needed some boundary between their sleeping spaces, and which I appreciated without saying so. I pulled my boots off and lay down on the mattress with my coat over the wool blankets and the Remington under my right hand, and I looked at the low ceiling of the loft and listened to the wind begin to move in the timber above the cabin. And I thought about the 7 women who had slept in this same space, and then gone back down the mountain. I thought, I understand why they left. This is a hard place and a harder man, and neither of them asks anything of you except everything. Then I thought, I have nowhere else to go. And then I was asleep. He woke me at 5 in the morning by standing at the foot of the ladder and saying, with no particular emphasis and no apparent awareness that 5 in the morning was an unusual hour to begin demanding things of people, "Work starts now." I pulled on my boots, I pulled on my coat, I climbed down the ladder. He was already dressed and had coffee poured. 2 cups, which was the first thing he had done that could be interpreted as a gesture toward my presence, though I was careful not to make too much of it. He handed one to me without looking at me. We drank standing up. Then he opened the cabin door and went outside, and I followed him into the dark and the cold of a Montana November morning that had decided overnight to remind everyone in it of its complete indifference to human comfort. The first week was a sustained physical assessment that he conducted without announcing it, and that I understood completely. He was not trying to break me. He was trying to find out who he was dealing with, which is a reasonable thing to want to know when a stranger has shown up at your door asking to share your cabin for the winter. The work was wood splitting and stacking, water hauling from the creek a 1/4 mile through knee-deep snow, trap checking along a 2-mile line through the timber, firewood carrying from the shed to the cabin, maintenance on the equipment he used, and the structures he kept. He worked from before dawn until the light was gone, and he expected me to keep pace, and he said almost nothing except what was necessary to direct the work. I kept pace. It cost me considerably. My hands blistered, and then re-blistered, and my back informed me, with increasing vehemence over the first several days, that it had not signed on for this. But I kept pace because the alternative was to not keep pace, and not keeping pace was not something I was willing to do. On the 3rd day, I slipped on the creek ice hauling water and went down hard, cracking my lip on a rock and going face first into the snow. The bucket went sideways, and I lost half of it. Driscoll was 10 feet ahead on the trail. He stopped, he turned. He looked at me in the snow. The look lasted perhaps 2 seconds, then I got up, picked up the bucket, assessed what remained, kept walking. He fell back into step beside me. He said nothing. But when we reached the cabin, he took the bucket from my hands and hung it himself, which was the first thing he had done for me that had not been strictly necessary. That evening, I sat at the table writing in the small journal I kept in the bottom of my bag. A habit from childhood, my mother's insistence. Keep a record, Eleanor. Keep a record of where you have been and what you have done, and who you have been to yourself in difficult circumstances, because memory is not reliable and paper is, if you take care of it. And I wrote, Day 3. He is running an assessment. I understand assessments. Thomas ran assessments too, but Thomas's were designed to find your limits so he could exploit them. Driscoll's appear to be designed to find your limits so he can plan around them. This is not the same thing. I am not yet sure if it is better, but it is different. The second week settled into something that was not yet comfortable, but was at least predictable, which is its own kind of relief. He gave instructions that were short and accurate. I followed them without commentary or complaint. We ate meals at the same table in silence, and it was not an unfriendly silence, which was different from what I had expected. On the 6th day, he showed me, without being asked and without explaining why he had decided to, how to check the trap mechanism for ice before touching it, running 2 fingers along the spring housing to feel for the particular roughness that meant the metal had contracted in the cold and would not release cleanly. It was practical information delivered practically, nothing more. But he had decided I needed it and given it to me without making it a transaction, and I noted this. On the 8th day, something happened that I also noted, though it took me some time to understand what I had noted. We came in from a long day on the trap line, 6 hours in temperatures that had dropped well below zero overnight and had not recovered. And I sat down at the table with my coat still on because my hands were too stiff to manage the buttons. He came in behind me, hung his own coat, went to the stove. A few minutes later, he set a cup of coffee in front of me without being asked. Then he went back to the stove and busied himself with the evening meal. He did not say anything about it. He did not look to see my reaction. It was simply, you are cold, there is coffee, here is the coffee. As if the logic were so self-evident that stating it would be a waste of breath. I wrapped my stiff hands around the cup and felt the warmth move through them and thought, I'm going to have to be careful here. Not because he is dangerous in the obvious way, but because small, genuine kindnesses from people who do not perform them are much harder to be unmoved by than large, dramatic gestures from people who do. I wrote that night, day 8. He left coffee for me without being asked. He did not watch to see if I noticed. I suspect this is how he operates. He does the thing that needs doing and then moves on, without requiring acknowledgement or gratitude. I find this both admirable and, in a way I cannot entirely articulate, deeply restful. Near the end of the second week, on a morning when the temperature had dropped to something that made the timber crack and the creek ice groan with the contraction, he stopped beside me at the woodpile and said, without looking up from the log he was splitting, "You stack better than anyone who has come up here." I said, "That is a low bar by your own accounting." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "It is still true." He swung the axe. The log split clean. I picked up the halves and added them to the stack, and I thought about those words for the rest of the day. And I did not write about them in my journal that night because some things you hold privately until you understand what they mean. What I did write was this. Day 14. I think I understand now why those 7 women left. It is not the cold and it is not the work, though both of those are real enough. It is him. Cormac Driscoll is a man who sees things very clearly and is honest about what he sees. And there is something in that clarity, once you become aware of it, that makes you want to be seen by it. And wanting to be seen by a man who has decided not to see anyone is a dangerous kind of wanting. I was right about that. I just did not yet know how right. The first real blizzard hit on day 16, which was a Friday, though the days of the week had already begun to lose their individual character on the mountain. Up here, what mattered was temperature and light, and the work the day required, not what it was called. The storm came down from the northern ranges in the mid-afternoon, with a speed that suggested it had been building for some time, and had simply been waiting for the right moment to commit. The sky dropped from its usual winter white to a darker gray in the space of an hour, and then the wind came, and then the snow, and within 2 hours of the first flake, the world outside the cabin had become a solid white wall of noise and motion. Driscoll closed the shutters on the windows and dropped the bar across the door and said, 3 days, maybe 4. He said it the way he said most things, as information, delivered neutrally without complaint or drama. The storm was a fact. The duration was a probable fact. There was no value in performing feelings about facts. We worked through the first day without difficulty. There was enough inside work to keep us both occupied. Gear to mend, supplies to organize, the stovepipe to clean, the trap mechanisms to oil and check. By the end of the first day, everything that could be done had been done, and the cabin was as prepared as it was possible to make it. By the end of the second day, the cabin felt smaller. By the beginning of the third day, it felt very small indeed, in the way that enclosed spaces do when two people have been in them together long enough to have exhausted all the obvious tasks and are left with nothing but each other's presence and the noise of the storm outside. I was mending a torn coat by the stove. Not my coat, but Thomas's coat, which I had taken from our Billings house because it was considerably warmer than mine, and because I had not yet managed to go through the pockets with any real thoroughness. I had been avoiding the pockets in the way a person avoids a necessary conversation that they know will be difficult. I had been telling myself I would do it when I was ready, and in the meantime the coat kept me warm, which was not nothing. The paper fell out of the inner pocket while I was working on the left cuff, where the lining had torn away from the seam. It was folded in quarters, and it fell to the floor between my boots. I saw it at the same moment Driscoll did. He was at the supply shelf with his back to me, taking inventory of the winter stores. He turned at the sound of the paper hitting the floor. It was a very quiet sound in an otherwise quiet cabin, the kind of sound you can only hear when everything else has gone still. And he crossed the room and picked it up before I could reach it. He unfolded it. He read it. His face did not change. He put it on the table between us. It was a copy of a land sale agreement. Copperhead Creek Valley parcels. I recognized the location descriptions, the creek boundaries, the mountain markers. Thomas Callahan listed as seller. Harlan Voss listed as buyer. A date from the previous spring. The parcels listed in that document did not belong to Thomas Callahan. They belonged to 3 homesteading families who had settled in the Copperhead Creek Valley the previous year, and who had, as far as I knew, no idea that the man they had purchased their grazing rights from had no legal standing to sell them. The blizzard outside found a new level of fury. The shutters rattled. Snow drove against the window glass in gusts. The fire in the stone fireplace pushed back against the cold, but the cold was very large, and the fire was comparatively small. Driscoll sat down across from me. He did not ask anything. He did not arrange his face into an expression of concern or accusation or careful neutrality. He simply sat and waited, which was, I was coming to understand, how he operated when he needed something from another person. He waited. He let the silence do the asking. I looked at the document. I looked at him. And then I told him. I will not pretend it was graceful because it was not. 8 months of silence came out of me like water from a pipe that has been under pressure for too long. Not a steady, controlled flow, but a release, sudden and too fast. And I had to work to slow it down enough to make it coherent. Thomas Callahan was not in debt to Harlan Voss. He was in business with him. Had been in business with him since 1876, 3 years after we came to Montana from Wyoming, where Thomas had been operating a similar scheme under the name Garrett before something, I did not know what, and I had not known enough to ask the right questions, had made it necessary to move. The Montana operation worked as follows. Voss held the legal mechanisms. He had the contacts in the Territorial Land Office. He had the financial relationships with Commissioner Aldrich. He had the attorneys who could produce documents that looked real enough to survive initial inspection. Thomas provided the interface. He was the one who met the settlers, the one who showed them the land, the one whose name went on the agreements. He was charming and convincing, And he had a gift for making people feel that they had found something genuinely good, which is, I suppose, the most essential quality in a successful fraud. When I found the papers 8 months ago, I had understood immediately what they meant. I had also understood immediately what my options were, which were go to the law, which was Aldrich, which was Voss, which was no option at all, run with no money and no family and no destination. Or stay and say nothing and keep Thomas's breakfast warm every morning and smile across the table at him and wait for something to change. I had stayed. I had said nothing. I had become complicit by silence, and the weight of that complicity had sat in my chest for 8 months like a stone I could not put down. Driscoll listened to all of it. He did not interrupt, did not ask clarifying questions, did not arrange his expression into anything I could read as judgment. He sat across the table in the lantern light with his hands folded and his eyes steady, and he listened to the whole thing. When I finished, the only sound was the storm outside and the fire and my own breathing, which was less controlled than I would have liked. He said, "How many families?" I said, 11 that I know of. There may be more. The records I saw covered the Copperhead Creek Valley and the Larimer County parcels. There were references to transactions I could not identify from the documents I found. And he said, "And you kept a copy." I said, "I kept 3, hidden in different places." Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth. I want to be precise about this because warmth is a word that gets applied to things it does not accurately describe. What I saw was something older than warmth, a recognition almost. The expression of a man who has been presented with information that corresponds to something he has been looking for, though he has not yet decided to tell you he has been looking for it. He said, "You were building a case." I said, "I was surviving. The case was a side effect." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, took the document from the table, crossed to the east wall, lifted 3-floor planks. I noted this, the location and the sequence, and put the document in the iron strongbox beneath. He lowered the planks. He went to the supply shelf and resumed his inventory. I sat at the table for a while longer with the storm raging outside and the fire working hard behind me, and thought about 11 families in the Copperhead Creek Valley who were living on land they did not own, and about the woman I had been for 8 months, and about the woman I was possibly trying to become, and about whether those 2 women could exist in the same body, or whether becoming one required the other to disappear entirely. Driscoll did not say anything else about it that night. He did not say, "I believe you," or "What do you want to do about it?" or "This changes things between us." He simply cooked the evening meal and set a portion in front of me and ate his own in his customary silence. But later that night, lying in the loft listening to the storm try to tear the roof off the mountain, I understood something. He had not asked me to explain myself further. He had not looked at me with the expression people wear when they are deciding whether to believe you. He had put the document somewhere safe without discussing it, which was an act of something, though I could not yet name what. Trust is too large a word for what it was. It was a provisional something, a willingness to let things be what they appeared to be, at least for now, and to see what happened next. I wrote in my journal by the light of the small candle I kept on the shelf above my mattress. Day 16. The storm is on its 3rd day. I have told him about Thomas, all of it. He did not send me away. He did not perform sympathy. He put the document somewhere safe and went back to the supply inventory, which is, I think, the correct response, though I could not tell you why I think so. I only know that it felt like being dealt with honestly, which is rarer than it should be and more valuable than I remembered. The storm lasted 4 days in the end. By the time it broke and the world outside the cabin resolved itself back into individual trees and a visible sky, something between us had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been apparent to an observer, but the quality of the silence at the table had changed. It had texture now, where before it had simply been absence. He noticed that I wrote in my journal every night. He did not ask what I wrote. I did not tell him. But one morning he left a new candle on the shelf beside my mattress without explanation, because the one I had been using was burning low. I wrote that night, day 20. He replaced my candle. He did not mention it. I find that I have begun to look forward to these small, unremarked gestures in a way that suggests I should be paying closer attention to what they are accumulating into. 10 days after the storm, on a morning so cold the air itself seemed to have achieved a new solidity, I broke a trap. The mechanism had frozen overnight. The temperature had plunged below 10 degrees and held there. And the cold in that range does things to metal that have to be accounted for. Things Driscoll knew, and I was still learning. When I went out to check the eastern trap line alone, moving through the gray pre-dawn light with the lantern in one hand and the rifle slung over my shoulder, I reached the third trap in the line and found the spring housing rimmed with ice. I should have felt for the ice before I touched the mechanism. He had told me early on to check for resistance before applying pressure. I had forgotten, or rather I had been moving quickly because the cold was serious, and I wanted to finish the line before full dark came back up, which is the particular kind of not forgetting that is really a choice made by tiredness. You know the rule and you discount it in the moment. The spring released wrong. The jaw caught the back of my left hand through the glove. The sound it made was not dramatic, a flat mechanical snap. But the sensation was immediate and serious, and I dropped the trap and pressed my right hand against the injury through the glove, and stood in the snow for a moment assessing what had happened. The glove was bleeding through. Not heavily, not the kind of bleeding that requires immediate improvisation, but steadily, which meant a real cut rather than a surface one. By the time I got back to the cabin, the glove was soaked through on the back, and my hand had gone from painful to numb, in the way that means the cold is doing some of the work the injury was doing, which is not an improvement so much as a different problem. Driscoll was at the workbench when I came in. He looked up. He looked at the glove. He stood up immediately. He said, "Sit down." I said, "It is not serious." He said, "Sit down." There was something in his voice on the second iteration that I had not heard before, not louder, not harder exactly, but with a quality underneath it that made it very clear he was not making a request. I sat down, because whatever that quality was, it was convincing. He pulled the medical kit from the high shelf, I had not known it was there, and brought it to the table. He pulled a chair around to sit beside me rather than across from me. He took my left hand very carefully in both of his and began to ease the glove off. His hands were large and had a roughness to them that years of outdoor work produces. Not a social roughness, not the kind performed for effect, but the real kind that accumulates in the skin of hands that are used seriously and constantly over time. But they were careful. They moved with a deliberate gentleness that was entirely at odds with everything else about him, and I was unprepared for it. He got the glove off, looked at the cut. It was about 2 inches long across the back of my hand, clean-edged from the trap jaw, not deep enough to require stitching, but deeper than I had hoped. He cleaned it with water from the jug, then with something from the kit that burned with a thoroughness that made me pull breath through my teeth. He looked at my face briefly, not checking my reaction exactly, more confirming information. He said, "The trap spring freezes below 10 degrees. The housing gets brittle. I should have told you to check for ice before you set your hand on it." I said, "You should have." He said, "I am telling you now." I said, "I noticed." He wrapped the wound with clean gauze from the kit, his hand still doing that careful thing, and tied it off with a precision that suggested he had dressed wounds before, many times, possibly in circumstances where the stakes were higher than a cut hand on a Montana mountain. When he finished, he did not immediately move his hands away. He held my bandaged hand in both of his for a moment, and I was aware of it with a specificity that I noted and then immediately directed my attention away from, because some things you cannot afford to look at directly until you are ready, and I was not yet ready. He said, "Do not touch the spring housing without checking for ice first. If you are not sure, press your palm flat against the housing and hold it for a 3 count. You will feel the difference between normal metal and frozen metal. They do not feel the same." I said, "All right." He put my hand down gently on the table and went back to the workbench. I sat at the table for a while longer, looking at the bandage, and thought about careful hands and the things that reveal themselves in the way a person touches something fragile. The days that followed were the beginning of something I found difficult to name at the time, though I understand it now well enough. We were learning each other. Not in the way that people learn each other when they are being deliberate about it, presenting information about themselves in organized fashion and receiving information in return. We were learning each other the way you learn a landscape, by moving through it repeatedly, by the accumulation of small observations, by the gradual development of an intuitive map of where the solid ground is and where you need to step carefully. He taught me to read tracks in the snow. This was practical. The trap line ran through territory that also saw wolf and mountain lion and occasionally bear. And knowing which tracks were which and how fresh they were was not an exercise in nature appreciation, but a matter of actual safety. But the teaching itself had a quality I had not expected. He did not explain the difference between a wolf print and a large dog's print by telling me about it. He crouched down in the snow beside a set of tracks and showed me with his own hand laid flat beside the print for scale. And then he pointed to specific features, the asymmetry in the toe spacing, the depth at the heel. And then he stood up and kept walking. And I looked at the tracks and looked at the features he had pointed to and understood, in a way that I would not have understood from a description alone. This was how he taught everything, by demonstration, by example, by trusting that a person could learn from watching rather than from being lectured at. It was a form of respect I came to understand, not a formal or announced respect, but the practical kind, the kind that assumes competence and intelligence without requiring their proof in advance. I was grateful for it in a way I did not know how to express and so did not attempt to. One evening, near the end of the 4th week, I made supper with a small tin of dried herbs I had been carrying at the bottom of my bag since Billings. Rosemary, thyme, and something my mother had grown in the small garden behind our house in County Cork, and called by an Irish name I had never been able to translate satisfactorily into English. I had dried the last of it myself the previous summer from a plant I had grown in a pot on the windowsill of our Billings kitchen, which was, I recognize now, a form of stubbornness about continuity that I was unaware of at the time. I added the herbs to the rabbit stew I had made from the morning's trapline results, and the cabin filled with a smell that stopped Driscoll in the middle of crossing the room from the workbench to the stove. He stopped and stood still for a moment. I watched him without appearing to. He breathed in. Something moved across his face that was there and gone so quickly I could not identify it with certainty, except that it was genuine, and that it came from somewhere he did not normally grant access to. Then he continued to the stove, and he sat down at the table, and he ate the entire pot. When I asked carefully if it was different from the usual, he said, and he said it the way he said most personal things, which is to say, looking at the table and not at me. My mother cooked with rosemary. I said, where is she now? He said, Butte. She died in 1871. I said, I am sorry. He said, she would have been 62 this year. He did not say anything else about it, but he had offered it, unsolicited, unprompted. And that was different from everything that had come before. I wrote that night. Day 28. He told me about his mother. One sentence. He looked at the table while he said it. I understand this completely. There are things you can only say sideways. If you say them directly, they lose something, some necessary quality of their weight or their reality. That only survives the saying if you approach it from an angle. The following week brought a 3-day stretch of moderate snow and work that kept us both moving from before dawn until dark, hauling the season's supply of wood from the timber to the shed in a sustained effort that neither of us spoke through because we did not have the breath to spare for speaking, and the work was clear enough not to need direction. When it was done, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, we sat down on the shed step together in the cold and looked at the stacked result. 12 cords tightly packed, covered with the tarpaulin he had been saving for this purpose. It was enough to see the cabin through even a severe winter without rationing. He said, That will last us through February, and into March if the spring comes late. I said, and if it comes late? He said, we cut more. We sat on the step in the cold for perhaps 10 minutes, not talking, looking at the stacked wood and the timber beyond it and the sky above that, which was the particular deep blue of a Montana late afternoon in December, a color that has no equivalent anywhere I've been before or since. He stood up first, as he always did, and went back toward the cabin. But before he reached the door, he stopped and turned back, and he looked at me, still sitting on the step, and he said, "You are better at this than I expected." I said, "Is that a compliment or an observation?" He said, "Does it have to be one or the other?" He went inside. I sat on the step a while longer in the cold and the blue light and the quiet, and I thought about those words, and about the 7 women who had come before me, and about what it meant that I was still here and they were not, and whether what it meant had more to do with me or with the mountain or with something else entirely that I could not yet name. I did not write about it in my journal that night. Some things need more time than a night before you know what to say about them. I found the badge on day 31. I was looking for a mending needle. The one I normally kept in the small tin on the shelf above the workbench had gone missing, and I had looked in the obvious places without success, and I was working through the less obvious places with the methodical patience that months of organized work in a confined space had taught me. The drawer in the workbench that held miscellaneous small items, wire, spare lamp wicks, a handful of nails, 2 buttons that had come off something and were waiting to go back on something, and had a latch that had been broken and then repaired with a bent nail that sometimes held and sometimes did not. It did not hold. The drawer came open further than I had intended, and I saw the badge at the back. Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Brass, heavy, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling. The distinctive eye in the center design that the agency used, above the words that formed their unofficial motto. We never sleep. I held it in my palm for a moment. I turned it over. The back was blank. I put it back exactly as I had found it, positioned at the same angle, at the same depth in the drawer. I pushed the drawer closed. I went and found the needle in a tin on a different shelf where I had misremembered putting it. I said nothing. I waited 10 days. The night I chose was in early February, a deep, cold night that had settled on the mountain with the particular settled quality of real winter. Not dramatic, not stormy, just enduringly, comprehensively cold. The kind of cold that is not a weather event but a condition of existence in this place at this time of year. Neither of us wanted to go to bed early because the loft would take another hour to warm from the residual heat of the stoves, and Driscoll had taken the clay jug from the high shelf and poured 2 cups of whiskey, without asking or explaining why, which meant it was one of the nights when he had decided that a certain amount of warmth was worth the price of the whiskey, which was, I had come to understand, not a regular occurrence and not a small decision. I took the cup he set in front of me. I took a sip. It was genuinely terrible, rough and sharp with a finish that suggested it had been made quickly and without excessive concern for quality, which was accurate, as he had told me on a previous occasion that he made it himself from the grain stores, primarily because the alternative was to go without. I said, "That is awful." He said, "Yes." He drank his with the expression of a man who knows something is bad and has made his peace with it. We sat in the companionable silence that had developed between us over 6 weeks of shared work and shared meals and shared storms. A silence with texture and ease, different from the early silence in the way that established things are different from new things. The fire worked against the cold. The lamp on the table put a circle of light around us. Outside the shuttered windows, the January dark pressed in with the weight of miles of empty country. I set down my cup. I said, "I found the badge." He did not move. He turned the cup slowly in his hands, and I watched the motion of it and thought, he already knew I had found it, or he suspected because he pays attention to everything, and he would have known the drawer had been opened. He said, "When?" I said, 10 days ago. He said, "And you waited." I said, "I wanted to see if you would tell me yourself." A pause of perhaps 5 seconds, which, on a scale where Driscoll's pauses were already calibrated toward the longer end, was not particularly long. He said, "I was not going to." I said, "I know. That is why I'm asking now." He looked at the fire for a while. Then he turned the cup a few more times in his hands. Then he reached into the broken latch drawer. He had crossed to the workbench and back without my fully noticing the movement. And he put the badge on the table between us. It looked like what it was. A significant object that had been put away with care and not looked at for some time. He said, 11 years. I waited. 11? He said, 11 years as a Pinkerton detective. I was good at it. The work was... It was real work, the kind where the outcome mattered, and you could see it matter. Cases that involved something actual and consequential. I believed in what I was doing, which is not a condition I have spent my whole life in, and which I valued accordingly. I said, "Until Wyoming." He looked at me briefly. He had not said Wyoming yet. He understood that I had deduced it, which was confirmation of something, though I could not have said exactly what. He said, "Until Wyoming, 1873. The case, as he described it, a land fraud operation in Fremont County, Wyoming Territory. A man operating under the name Garrett, this was one of the aliases, not the only one, who had been selling fraudulent deed titles to homesteading families across the county. Mac had tracked him for 4 months. He had the evidence, witness statements, forged documents, financial records, and he had found the man and was prepared to bring him in. He stopped here. He was looking at the badge on the table between us rather than at me, and I looked at the badge too, and the fire settled behind us with a sound like an intake of breath. He said, "When I found him, he was already making it right." He had gone to each family, personally alone without anyone making him do it. He had told them what he had done, and he had paid them back, his own money, which amounted to everything he had. And he had been in the middle of this process, 3 families done and 4 still to go, when Mac had tracked him down. Mac said, "The man the agency wanted to make an example of was trying to fix what he had broken. He was not doing it because he had been caught. He had not been caught yet. He was doing it because he had decided on his own that it was wrong and that he had to make it right." I said, "So you let him go?" He said, "I resigned rather than bring him in. The agency had a different view of the situation. They wanted the arrest, the newspaper coverage, the demonstration of Pinkerton effectiveness. I decided that the coverage was not worth the man, and that bringing him in while he was in the middle of making restitution would be a different kind of wrong than the one he had already committed." He picked up the badge from the table and held it in one hand. He said, "They blacklisted me. I had expected that. Clara died that same autumn. My sister, she was 24, typhoid fever. She was living in Billings while I was in Wyoming, and I was on the road back when she died, and I did not get there in time." He stopped. "I came up here the following spring because I needed to be somewhere that did not require me to be any particular thing for anyone, and because the mountain did not care what I had done or not done, which at the time seemed like a recommendation." I was looking at the badge in his hand. And then something happened that I can only describe as the particular sensation of understanding arriving too fast and too completely to be managed, like stepping on ice that is thinner than you realized. I said, "The man in Wyoming, the alias Garrett." He said, "One of several. He operated under different names in different territories." I said, "Thomas used that name before we came to Montana, before he was Thomas Callahan." The fire crackled. Neither of us moved. He said very quietly, "Before or after Wyoming?" I said, "After." He told me once that Wyoming had been... He said it had gotten complicated. He did not say more than that, and I did not ask more than that, because with Thomas, more than that was never safer than less. Mac set the badge down on the table. He set it down with the same care he had picked it up with, and then he put both his hands flat on the table and looked at them. He said, "I let him go because I believed he had turned himself around. And he went to Montana and he built a larger operation." I said, "You could not have known." He said, "The count does not change." He meant 11 families and possibly more. The count of people who were living on ground they did not own because Mac had exercised a moral judgment that turned out to be wrong. Not wrong as a judgment, not wrong in principle, but wrong in its assessment of the specific man, which is a different and perhaps harder kind of wrong. He stood up abruptly and put on his coat and went outside into the February dark without another word. I did not follow him. Some men need air when they are processing something too large for an enclosed space, and following them is not help. It is company they have not asked for and cannot use. I sat at the table with the badge and the whiskey cups and the fire and the storm of my own thoughts, which were, Mac had let Thomas go in Wyoming, believing Thomas would do differently. Thomas had done worse. And I had stayed with Thomas and said nothing for 8 months after I found out, which was its own kind of wrong judgment, its own kind of complicity. We had both misjudged the same man, in different directions, at different times, for different reasons. I did not know yet what to do with that. Mac came back an hour before dawn. He sat down across from me. I had not slept, and he could see that, and he did not remark on it. He looked at the badge on the table for a long moment. Then he put it in his coat pocket, not back in the drawer, his coat pocket. He said, "I'm not sending you away. I said, "I did not think you were." He said, "Get some sleep. Traps need running at first light." He climbed the ladder to the loft. I stayed at the table for a while longer, looking at the fire, thinking about wrong judgments and the people they were made about and the people who made them, and whether the fact of a wrong judgment was something you carried in you permanently, or something you could put down, eventually, and whether putting it down was the same as being free of it, or merely the same as pretending. Then I climbed up the ladder too, and I lay in my side of the loft and listened to Driscoll's breathing in the dark on his side of the canvas curtain, and I thought, we are two people who made wrong judgments about the same man, and we are both up here on this mountain partly because of it, and there is something in that shared fact that is not comfort exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that functions like common ground. I wrote nothing that night. Some things are too complicated for the journal, at least until you know what they mean. In early March, Mac told me he needed to make his seasonal supply run to Copperhead Creek. He said it the way he said most practical things, as information, without preamble or apology, sitting across from me at the breakfast table with his coffee and his habit of looking at the middle distance when he was thinking about logistics, rather than at the person he was speaking to. 3 days down, 1 day in town acquiring what we needed, 3 days back, a week at minimum if the lower road was still iced, which at this elevation in early March it almost certainly would be. I said, "All right," he said. "I will leave you both rifles and enough ammunition to handle whatever comes up the trail." I said, "All right." He said, "Agnes will have the list of what we need. She has been holding some items since my last run." I said, "All right." He looked at me then, directly, which was not his default orientation when we spoke. He said, "You will be fine." I said, "I know." What I did not say was, "I know I will be fine." I am not worried about being fine. I am worried about something I cannot name yet, which is the particular discomfort of a person who has become accustomed to the presence of another person and who is about to discover, for the first time, what that accustomedness amounts to. The morning before he left, he did 2 things that I did not fully understand until later. He wrote 2 letters at the table after supper. He wrote them by lamplight with the focused attention he brought to everything he did deliberately. And when he finished, he sealed them both with wax from the candle and set them beside his coffee cup. He picked up one of them and held it out to me across the table. He said, "Do not open this unless I am not back by day 5. I took it. I put it in my coat pocket, which was hanging on the peg by the door. The second letter he put in his own coat pocket. He did not explain it, and I did not ask, because I had learned over 2.5 months on this mountain that Driscoll did things when he was ready to do them and explained them when he was ready to explain them, and pushing the schedule on either one produced nothing useful. Then he walked through the entire cabin with me, every inch of it. He showed me where the reserve ammunition was stored, not on the main shelf where the everyday ammunition lived, but in the oilskin wrap under the floor plank in the northeast corner, where it would stay dry even if the roof took on water. He showed me the window bar mechanism on the east window, which was the one most vulnerable to a determined person outside, and he showed me how to brace it with the length of timber he had cut for exactly that purpose and kept beside the wood pile inside the door. He showed me the emergency flares, 3 of them wrapped in oilskin and buried under the east floor plank beside the ammunition, and he described the conditions under which I should use one. If I was injured, if someone came up the trail who should not have, if the cabin caught fire, if something happened that I could not handle alone and needed someone from the valley below to come. He said, "Someone in Copperhead Creek will see the flare in the dark. Agnes will come, or she will send someone." I said, "How do you know Agnes will come?" He said, "Because Agnes is the kind of person who comes." He demonstrated the signal for the flares. 1 flare meant distress but manageable. 2 flares meant come now. 3 flares meant come now and bring help. He made me repeat the sequence back to him twice. I said, "You are acting like you are not coming back." He said, "I am acting like someone who has lived alone long enough to know that preparation is not pessimism. It is the difference between a problem and a catastrophe." He saddled the roan gelding before first light the following morning. He loaded the pack saddle with the empty containers for bringing back supplies, the list of what we needed, which I had helped him compile over the previous week, and the cash from the metal box he kept under the floorboards, which he counted out and wrapped in oilskin with the methodical precision of a man who has done this enough times to have a system. When the horse was ready, he came back inside. He put on his coat. He picked up his rifle. He stood in the middle of the cabin and looked around it with the look of a man confirming that everything is as it should be. Then he looked at me. He said, 5 days. If I'm not back on day 5, open the letter. I said, I will. He went out. I heard him mount up, heard the roan's hooves on the frozen ground of the clearing, heard both sounds fade into the timber as he took the switchback down toward the valley. Then silence. The particular silence of a space that has contained 2 people and now contains 1. I stood in the middle of the cabin for a moment and took inventory of how it felt. It felt larger than it had been. It felt quieter in a way that was different from the quiet that existed when we were both in it, and neither of us was speaking, which had always been a comfortable quiet. This was a different kind of quiet, the kind that is defined by what is missing. I went and checked the traps. The first 2 days were manageable. I held to the routines we had established: trap line in the morning, water haul, firewood from the shed to the cabin, the small maintenance tasks that the cabin required daily to keep it functional. The weather held, cold but clear, with the particular brilliant emptiness of a March sky at elevation that makes everything look closer and sharper than it is. I ate at the table alone and found that I looked up from my food more than I needed to. The space across the table had not been the space across the table before. It had been where Mac sat. The distinction was small and significant in equal measure. I wrote in my journal on the second night, Day 2 without him. The cabin is the same temperature. The food is the same food. The work is the same work. The mountain has not changed. I have apparently changed, or at least the way I experience this place has changed, which amounts to the same thing. I did not expect this. I should have expected this. The third day brought a rider. I heard the horse before I saw it on a single animal, moving carefully on the upper trail. Not the pace of someone making time, but the deliberate pace of someone picking their way through uncertain footing. I took the rifle from the wall and went to the window. He came out of the tree line at the edge of the clearing and stopped his horse and looked at the cabin with the particular look of a man who is confirming that things are where he expected them to be. He was perhaps 40 years old, broad in the chest, with a county deputy's badge on his coat catching the thin afternoon sun. His horse was too well bred for a deputy's salary. A fine bay gelding, well maintained, with the look of an animal that had been purchased by someone who could afford good stock. He wore his revolver on his right hip in a way that suggested he had worn it there for a long time and did not think about it consciously, which is either comforting or not, depending on what you know about the man carrying it. He smiled when I appeared in the window. The smile involved all the right muscles and produced none of the warmth that smiles are supposed to produce. He called out, "Morning, ma'am. Deputy Silas Pruitt, out of Copperhead Creek. Making my regular patrol of the upper valley. Mind if I come in?" I said through the window. "Mr. Driscoll is not here." He said, "I figured as much. Saw his tracks heading down the trail yesterday. Just checking on folks wintering up here. Cold stretch this week." I said, "I am fine." He said, "Sure you are. You look like a capable woman." He smiled again. "How long has Driscoll been gone?" I said, "I do not keep his schedule." He nodded like this was a reasonable answer. He looked at the cabin, at the shed, at the timber line, in a way that was not exactly suspicious, but was not exactly not suspicious either. He said, "Well, you let him know Deputy Pruitt came by. Tell him we appreciate folks keeping an eye on these upper trails. Mountain lion sign up near Ridgeline Pass last week. Worth knowing about." I said, "I will tell him." He turned his horse. He moved toward the tree line at the same deliberate pace he had come in with. Then, over his shoulder without turning around, "You have a safe rest of your winter, Mrs. Callahan." I had not told him my name. I stood at the window and watched until the timber closed behind him. Then I went and checked that the door bar was in its bracket and that the east window was latched. Then I sat down at the table and thought about how Silas Pruitt knew my name. Mac came back on day 4 in the late afternoon with the roan and a loaded pack horse, and a face that had been doing hard thinking for long enough that the thinking had left marks on it. He unloaded the horses in the shed without talking. When he came inside, I had coffee on the stove. He hung his coat, sat down, took the cup I put in front of him, and drank half of it before he said, "Someone in Copperhead Creek has been asking about you." I said, "I know. Pruitt came up here on day 3. Mac put the cup down. I told him about the visit, about the badge, the horse, the smile, the name. Mac listened with the quality of attention he brought to things that required it, complete, concentrated, with nothing held back for other purposes. When I finished, he sat for a moment longer with his hands around the cup. He said, "Silas Pruitt was appointed by Commissioner Aldrich 18 months ago. Aldrich has had financial arrangements with Harlan Voss since the Northern Pacific Land Surveys of 1875. He looked at me steadily. "Pruitt is not corrupt in the accidental way. He is corrupt in the deliberate way. A man who chose a side and committed to it, and who does specific work for the people on his side when they need specific work done." I said, "And the specific work right now is finding out where I am." He said, "Has been since before you arrived. Voss knew you had something. He did not know you had left Billings until his man in the dry goods store here in Copperhead Creek saw you come off the stage in November." I said, "And Pruitt saw me today." He said, "Which means Voss will know your location within the week, if he does not already." The fire crackled between us. Outside the shuttered windows, the March wind moved in the timber with a sound that was not quite like anything else. I said, "How long do we have?" He said, "Voss does not move until he is certain, and he is not a man who makes premature moves. He will want to understand the situation before he rides up a mountain in early spring." He paused. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Then he told me about the second letter, the one he had taken with him to Copperhead Creek. He had left it with Agnes, sealed, with specific written instructions. If she did not receive a follow-up letter from him within 30 days, she was to send the sealed envelope to a federal circuit judge in Helena named Harlan P. Stoddard. Mac had corresponded with Judge Stoddard 2 years earlier, regarding a land fraud case in the Bitterroot Valley that had ultimately not proceeded. Mac had found the evidence insufficient for a federal charge, but the correspondence had been professional and respectful, and Mac had reason to believe that Stoddard was the kind of judge who took his responsibilities seriously and who was not subject to Aldrich's financial arrangements. I said, "You planned for this before I came," he said. "I planned for the possibility that it might become necessary. Voss has been operating in this valley for 3 years. I have been watching him for 2 of those years. I have a body of evidence on his operation. But a federal case requires a first-hand witness, someone who can testify under oath to the specific mechanics of the fraud." I said, "And then I came up your mountain," he said. "And then you came up the mountain, yes." He looked at me with the directness he reserved for things he wanted to be unambiguous about. He said, "I did not know about your document until you showed me. I did not understand that you were the witness the case needed until this week, when Pruitt's visit made clear that Voss considers you specifically important to his interests. But I want you to understand the situation you are in, and I want you to understand it from me rather than from circumstances." I sat with this for a moment. I said, "What happens if Voss comes before the 30 days are up?" He said, "Then we deal with Voss." He said it the way he said most true things, flatly, without drama, as a statement of what was rather than what should be. That night he reorganized the cabin's defensive arrangements without commentary, moved the second rifle to within reach of the stove, showed me the specific angle through the left shutter that covered the full approach to the clearing, tested the east window bar 3 times. When he was satisfied, he sat down by the fire. After a while, he put his hand over mine on the arm of the chair. Not a romantic gesture. Not yet. The gesture of a person who has decided that the distance between them and another person is more than the situation warrants, and who is doing something about it without making a declaration about it. I looked at his hand on mine. I thought about the last time a man's hand on mine at a table had meant something and what that something had cost me, and whether the cost was a reason to pull away or a reason to stay. I stayed. I said, "I know." And I meant it, which surprised me more than it should have. March gave way to April, the way seasons change at elevation. Not with any particular ceremony, not with the dramatic thaw of the valley below, but with a slow and grudging modulation, the cold retreating a degree at a time, the light lasting a few minutes longer each day, the timber beginning to show the first faint suggestion of something that was not winter, though winter was not done. Something else modulated at the same pace, by the same slow degrees, without announcement. Mac talked more. This is the simplest way to say it, though simple does not quite cover it. It was not that he had been withholding speech before. He had never been a man who withheld speech as a strategy, which would have implied a calculation that he did not operate by. He spoke when there was something to say, and he had said less before because there had been less between us to speak about, and now there was more, so he said more. The logic was simple. The effect was not simple at all. He told me about growing up in Butte. His father had worked the copper mines there, not as a manager or owner, but as a man who went into the earth 6 days a week for wages that were adequate and not more than adequate. Mac had followed him into the mines at 14 because the family needed it, and because his father's needs were not optional, not a discussion, not something that left room for the preferences of a 14-year-old who had other ideas about his own future. He described the mines the way a person describes something that made them rather than something that happened to them, with a matter-of-fact directness that did not perform either bitterness or nobility. It was what it was. It had made him what he was. He had left at 22 when he had saved enough to have a choice, and he had not gone back. He told me about Clara, more than he had before, not just the fact of her, but the specific person she had been. She had wanted to be a school teacher, which was not a small ambition for a woman in 1873, and she had the qualities it would have required: patience, real intelligence, the particular capacity for sustained attention to other people that teaching demands. She had been living in Billings while Mac was in Wyoming on the Garrett case. She had gotten sick in September. By the time the letter reached him on the road, she had been gone for 2 weeks. He said, "I was 4 days' ride away." She had been sick for 3 weeks before anyone thought to write to me. I did not know she was ill until she was already gone. I said, "I am sorry." He said, "I think about that sometimes. Whether it would have mattered if I had known earlier, whether being there would have changed anything." He looked at the fire. "I think it would not have. But I also think the question is not really about changing anything. It is about being present. About being there even when you cannot fix it. I understood this completely, in the way you understand things that correspond to something you have already felt but not yet named. I said, "My father died when I was 18. He had been sick for 6 months before I knew how sick. He did not want to worry me." I paused. I was not there either. I was in Billings working, sending money home. By the time his letter reached me, the letter after the letter he should have sent was already on its way. Mac turned his head and looked at me, not with the assessment look of the early weeks, with something else, the look of a person who has been handed something true. He said, "The same kind of wrong." I said, "Yes, the same kind." We sat with that for a while. The fire and the lamp and the sound of the April wind outside that was not yet warm, but was thinking about it. He told me about the Pinkerton years. Not the Wyoming case, we had covered that. But the years before it, the 11 years of work that he had found genuinely meaningful, and that he had lost, along with Clara, in the autumn of 1873. He talked about specific cases with a specificity that suggested he had not talked about them in a long time, and that the talking was doing something, not healing exactly, which is a word that gets applied too broadly, but ventilating, the way you open a room that has been closed for too long and let the air move through it. I told him about County Cork, about the house my father had built himself on a hillside above a small harbor, about the smell of it in the morning, about my mother's herb garden and the particular quality of the light in the west of Ireland in late summer, which is different from any light I have seen since, about leaving, which we had not chosen, but which hunger and the absence of alternatives had chosen for us, which is how most of the large things in most people's lives are decided. About coming to America at 12 and discovering that the poverty was different here but not absent, and that the loneliness was different here too. The loneliness of an immigrant, which has its own particular texture. The loneliness of a person who knows that the world they belong to has been left behind, and that the new world has not yet decided whether to include them. He listened to all of it with the complete attention he gave to things he considered worth attending to. When I finished, he said, "How old were you when you married Thomas?" I said, 21. He said, "And you were alone in Billings from 12. I said, "My mother died when I was 16, my father the year after." He said, "So you had been alone for 5 years before Thomas." I said, "Yes." He said, "5 years is long enough to mistake almost anything for something better." It was not an absolution. He was not the kind of man who offered absolution, and I was not the kind of woman who required it, not from him. But it was an accurate statement, and accuracy from someone whose accuracy I had come to trust was its own kind of thing. The kiss happened on a Tuesday. I am specific about the day, because specificity matters when you are trying to be honest about the sequence of events, and because the ordinariness of the day is part of what made it real. Not a dramatic evening, not a moment constructed for the purpose. Just a Tuesday in the middle of a working week in early April on a mountain in Montana where two people who had been gradually becoming necessary to each other finally acknowledged it. We were at the workbench. He was showing me how to retension a trap spring without risking the mechanism in cold temperatures, a process that required pressure at a specific angle and a specific rate of increase. And he was demonstrating with his hands, and I was watching his hands, and then I was not watching his hands. I looked up. He was already looking at me. He had been for some time, and he had not looked away when I looked up, which was itself a kind of answer to a question I had not yet finished asking. He kissed me the way he did most things that mattered, slowly, with complete intention, giving me time to make my own decision. His hand came up to my jaw, careful, with that same gentleness I had first noticed when he dressed my cut hand in January. The gentleness that was entirely at odds with the rest of him, and therefore meant more than it would have meant in a less careful man. When we separated, he said, "I do not know how to do this anymore." I said, "Neither do I. But I think we have both been not doing it long enough." He looked at me for a moment with the gray-green eyes that I'd been reading carefully for months, and that I was only now beginning to feel I could actually read. He said, "Yes." In the 2 weeks that followed, I tracked symptoms in the back pages of my journal, with the careful notation of a woman who suspects something and is not yet ready to confirm it. Fatigue beyond what the work accounted for. A particular kind of morning nausea that came and went with a predictability I was coming to dread. A sensitivity to the smell of coffee that had always been one of my reliabilities, and was now, inexplicably, something I had to leave the cabin to avoid. I knew. I knew before I finished the accounting. But I sat with the knowing for an afternoon, because knowing a thing and saying it out loud are two different events with two different weights, and I needed to carry the first one alone for a few hours before I made it the second. I told him that evening before supper. I chose before supper deliberately, and not after, when the meal might feel like an attempt to soften the news, but before, when there was nothing between us and the thing I needed to say. I said, "I am pregnant. About 6 weeks, I think. Maybe 7. He set down the pot he was holding. He set it down with extreme care, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely trustworthy. I said, "It is yours. The timing. There is no possibility it is anyone else's." He did not say anything immediately. The particular quality of this silence was different from his other silences. Denser, more interior. The silence of a man working through something real at speed. He said finally, "We are 4 days' hard ride from the nearest doctor. 5 if the passes are still iced." I said, "I know." He said, "The delivery will be in December. Deep winter." I said, "I know." And he said, "If something goes wrong, if there are complications." I said, "Mac." He stopped. I said, "I know all of it. I have been sitting with all of it since this afternoon. I have read 3 of the 4 books you brought back from your last supply run. I know the risks. I know what can go wrong. And I know that out here, wrong has fewer remedies than in town." I looked at him steadily. "I am not asking you to fix it. I am not asking you to pretend the risks are not real. I am telling you because you have the right to know, and because—" My voice did something I had not given it permission to do. I said, "Because I do not want to carry this alone." He crossed the cabin. He put his arms around me, not with the tentativeness of someone uncertain, but with the completeness of someone who has made a decision and is done deliberating. His chin came down on top of my head. I could feel the steadiness of him, which was real and not performed, and which was the thing I had needed without knowing it was what I needed. He said into my hair, "We prepare. We learn everything we need to know. We get the right supplies. We build a plan, and we execute it. And if the plan needs to change, we change the plan." I said, "And if changing the plan is not enough?" He said, "Then we build a better one. But we do not spend time between now and then imagining outcomes we have not reached yet. We focus on what is in front of us, and we do what needs doing." He said it with a conviction that was not bravado, not the false certainty of a man who does not understand the stakes, but the practical conviction of a man who has faced serious things before, and who knows that the way you face serious things is one step at a time, with your eyes open and with whoever is beside you. Over the following 2 weeks, he threw himself into preparation with the focused intensity of a man who has found something specific and consequential to do and is grateful for the specificity. He made a supply run to Copperhead Creek, a quick one, 5 days total, which he planned with the efficiency of someone who has been doing this for years and knows how to cut the time. He came back with medical supplies from the retired nurse in town whose name was Mrs. Hendricks, and who had spent 20 years as a frontier midwife before her hips made travel impossible. Sterile gauze in sealed oilskin packets, antiseptic solution, a blood pressure cuff, pain medication, forceps of the kind that might be necessary in certain complications. He also came back with books. A modern guide to pregnancy and childbirth, published in 1876 by a physician in Chicago who had clearly thought carefully about what a layperson would need to know. An older midwifery manual from 1858, more practical in some ways, more direct about the things that could go wrong and what to do about them. A veterinary text with sections on difficult animal deliveries that Mac had decided, with the pragmatic flexibility of a man not limited by convention, might contain information applicable to the situation. He read all three with the same concentrated attention he brought to everything he considered worth reading. He made notes in the margins. He asked me questions, specific clinical questions about how I was feeling and when and in what circumstances, that I answered as accurately as I could, because accuracy was the thing we both had to work with. He began, without announcing it, to build a second room. One morning I woke up and he was framing out an interior wall. He did not explain it. I did not ask. By the end of the following week, there was a room with its own small stove and proper insulation. He had packed the wall space with layers of dried moss and timber sawdust, which he told me had twice the insulating value of the original cabin walls, and a door that latched firmly, and a window on the south side that got the afternoon sun. It was a room for a baby. Neither of us said so. Both of us knew. I watched him work on it in the evenings, after the day's other work was done, adding boards by lamplight with the focused patience of a man building something that needs to last. And I thought about the 7 women who had come before me, and about what Agnes had said, not cruel, just used up, and about how wrong that had turned out to be. Or rather, how accurately it had described a condition rather than a character, and how a condition can change. One evening I said, "You are going to be good at this." He said, "At what specifically?" I said, "At being a father." He was quiet for a moment. He kept working. He said, "I am not sure that is a safe assumption." I said, "It is not an assumption. It is an observation." He said, "Based on what?" I said, "Based on 4 months of watching you. You are careful about the things you are responsible for. You prepare. You learn what you do not know. You do not perform feelings you do not have. And you do not withhold ones you do." I paused. "Those are the things that matter." He looked at me across the half-built wall, the lamplight between us. He said, "My father was not that kind of man." I said, "I know. That is why you know what the right kind looks like." He was quiet for a long time after that. He went back to work. But later, when we were sitting by the fire after the supper dishes were washed, he said, "I had decided I would not have children. After Clara died, after Wyoming, I had decided that I was not, that the kind of life I was living was not a kind of life you brought children into." I said, "And now?" He said, "And now I find that the decision has been revised." He said it with the dry precision he sometimes deployed when the alternative was to say something he was not yet equipped to say more directly. I understood the translation. I thought it was sufficient. By the middle of April, I was visibly pregnant, not dramatically, not in the way that announces itself across a room, but unmistakably, the particular change in the line of the body that a woman knows from inside, and that those who look carefully can see from outside. Mac had reorganized the work distribution over the preceding weeks, with the same seamless efficiency he applied to everything. The heavy outdoor labor had shifted to him without discussion or fanfare, the way water shifts to fill the lower space. I continued with the trapline, the cooking, the maintenance work, the indoor tasks, the cabin management. The division was not stated. It simply occurred like most of the important things between us. He had finished the second room. It had a proper door that hung true on hand-forged hinges, a window that caught the afternoon light, a small stove that held heat through the night, shelving for the supplies we were accumulating. And in the corner that got the most warmth, a wooden chair he had built from timber over the course of 3 evenings, with a back that curved slightly in a way that was clearly deliberate and clearly had been thought about. He put the chair there and did not mention it. I sat in it one afternoon while he was outside and thought about the particular quality of a person who makes things for other people and does not require the making to be acknowledged. I also thought about Voss. I thought about him more as April deepened, not with the consuming fear of the early weeks, but with the steady background awareness of someone who knows that a difficult thing is coming and is trying to make sure she is ready when it arrives. Mac and I had talked about the timeline. We had talked about what Voss was likely to do and when. We had talked practically and without flinching about what we would do in response. What we had not talked about, because it was the thing neither of us could fully plan for, was what would happen if Voss moved faster than expected, or with more force than we had anticipated, or at a moment when our preparations were not yet complete. On a Tuesday morning in the middle of April, the trapline bells rang. Mac had strung them along the south approach 6 weeks earlier. Gut, cord, and tin washers, simple and absolutely reliable. The kind of alarm system that works because it requires nothing from the person who set it, except that they set it correctly. 2 clear rings. Then silence. Mac was dressed and had his rifle before I reached the bottom of the ladder. We stood at the window together and watched them come out of the tree line. 3 riders. Harlan Voss in the center, wearing a wool overcoat that had cost more than the cabin's entire contents, and that was wholly inadequate to the actual conditions of a Montana mountain in April, which told me something about Harlan Voss, that he was a man who prioritized the appearance of prosperity over its practical requirements. Deputy Pruitt to his right, on the same expensive bay gelding. A third man to the left, younger, lean, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who are paid to be ready for specific things. Mac opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch, rifle in his right hand, barrel angled toward the ground, not raised, his left hand loose at his side. I stood in the doorway behind him, and to the left, where the second rifle was propped against the interior wall within reach. Voss dismounted with the deliberate ease of a man performing confidence. He smiled. The smile was practiced and specific, and it did not reach anything behind it. He said, "Mr. Driscoll, I have heard considerable things about you. Pinkerton man before the regrettable circumstances of your departure. Impressive record from what I understand." Mac said, "State your business." Voss said, "Of course, directly, as you prefer." He reached into his coat and produced 2 documents, which he held up with the presentation of a man who has rehearsed the gesture. "I have here a territorial court debt judgment. Mrs. Callahan, as the surviving spouse of Thomas Callahan, is liable for her late husband's outstanding obligations under Montana Territory succession law. The judgment is signed by Judge Clarence Whitfield of the 2nd Territorial District." He smiled again. "And I have something else." He produced the second document with the particular pleasure of a man playing the card he has been saving. He said, "A federal arrest warrant for Cormac Driscoll on the charge of murder in the 1st degree. The named victim is Robert Fenwick, a Pinkerton National Detective Agency operative killed in Fremont County, Wyoming Territory, in October of 1873. The warrant alleges that Mr. Driscoll killed Fenwick while operating as an informant within the Callaway land fraud ring." Mac did not move. He read both documents. Voss had handed them to Pruitt, who had brought them forward, with the steady attention of a man reading something that does not surprise him, but that he wants to understand precisely. The warrant was a forgery. I was certain of this because I knew what Mac had actually done in Wyoming, and it was not this. But the forgery was a good one. It bore the appropriate seals, the appropriate language, the appropriate signatures, and it had clearly been produced by someone who understood federal legal documents well enough to replicate their form accurately. Voss said, "Both matters can be resolved quietly, and to everyone's reasonable satisfaction if we can come to a practical understanding. Then he looked at me. He looked at my midsection for perhaps 2 seconds. His expression did not alter. He said, "I should note, Mrs. Callahan, that under the territorial succession provisions applicable to the judgment, the estate's liabilities extend to assets and interests acquired after the death of the debtor. This would include, in the fullness of time, the interests of any subsequent issue." He paused. "Children born into debt tend to carry it. I would hate for your current situation to complicate matters further than necessary." The third man's hand moved toward his holster. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, the kind of movement that is designed to be noticed without being obvious about the noticing. Mac took 1 step forward. It was only 1 step. But something in the quality of that 1 step, in the complete absence of hesitation, in the absolute stillness of Mac's face, in the way his weight shifted with the practiced economy of a man who has faced armed people before, and who has developed over years a very specific and reliable response to it, stopped the third man's hand where it was. Mac said, "You will have our answer tomorrow morning. Ride back down." Voss looked at Mac for a moment. Behind the practiced ease, something calculated was happening. He was assessing distance, positions, the likelihood of various outcomes. He arrived at his conclusion, and he nodded pleasantly. He said, "Of course, we will speak in the morning." They turned their horses and rode back into the timber without hurrying. The unhurried quality was deliberate, the performance of a man who believes the outcome is already determined and feels no need to rush toward it. Mac stood on the porch until the sound of the horses was gone entirely. Then he turned and came inside and closed the door. He said, "The warrant is forged." I said, "I know." He said, "Voss has had it prepared for some time. He would not have produced it unless he was certain he needed it, which means he is certain he cannot get what he wants from you through the debt judgment alone." I said, "What does he want from me?" He said, "He wants the copies of the contract. He wants to know how many there are and where they are. And he wants to make sure you cannot testify to what you know." He went to the east wall. He lifted the 3-floor planks in the sequence I had watched him use twice before. He pulled out the iron strongbox, not the small one, the large one I had not seen him open before, and set it on the table. He looked at me across the box. He said, "I told you I let a man go in Wyoming because I believed he was trying to make things right. What I did not tell you is what I did after I left the Pinkertons." He opened the box. Inside was 5 years of work. Deed transfer records from the Copperhead Creek Valley and the Larimer County parcels, each one annotated in Mac's handwriting with the specific family name, the amount paid, the date of transaction, and the reference number of the fraudulent title. Signed witness statements from settlers, 11 of them, collected during supply runs over 3 years, written in Mac's hand from the settlers' own words, signed and dated and thumbprinted by each family. Financial correspondence between Voss and Commissioner Aldrich, 3 letters, each one specific enough to be damaging in a federal court. A ledger page, a single page, handwritten in what I recognized immediately as Voss's script, listing transactions by parcel number, with a column for amounts paid to Aldrich, and a column for amounts passed to the Territorial Land Office contact. And one gap. A gap the shape of a first-hand witness who had been inside Thomas Callahan's operation and who could testify to its mechanics under oath. Mac said, "I have been building this case for 2 years, quietly, without telling anyone, including Agnes, what I was building or why." He looked at me steadily. "I did not come to this mountain to hide, Ellie. I came here because the ridge gives a clear line of sight over the entire Copperhead Creek Valley, which is the operational center of Voss's Montana scheme. I have been here because building a federal case against a man with Voss's resources and connections requires patience and invisibility. I have been both." He said it without drama, without the performance of revelation, as information, as the truth of his situation, delivered because the situation now required it. I said, And the document I was carrying, he said, is the piece I have been missing for 2 years. A physical copy of a fraudulent contract in Voss's name that can be introduced as primary evidence in a federal proceeding. The fire worked behind us. The April wind moved in the timber outside. The mountain was what it always was. Large, indifferent, entirely unchanged by what was happening in the cabin at its foot. He said, I know what this looks like. I said, what does it look like? He said, like I had reasons for letting you stay that were not the reasons I gave you. I said, did you? He said, when you came up this mountain, I had no idea who you were or what you were carrying. When you showed me the document, I knew what it was, and I understood its value. But I did not tell you this because I did not know yet whether I could trust you with the full picture, and because I was afraid that if I told you, you would decide the situation was too dangerous and leave. He said the last part to the table rather than to me, which was how he said the things that cost him. I was quiet for a moment. I was taking inventory, the way I had learned to take inventory. Quickly, without the interference of the reaction I was having, because the reaction could wait and the accounting could not. He had let me stay, in part, because I was useful to something he was building. He had not told me about the building. He had made a judgment about what I could handle and when, which was a judgment he had made without asking me. These were all true. Also true, he had dressed my hand when I cut it. He had replaced my candle without being asked. He had built a room with a chair that curved to fit a person's back. He had put his hands around me when I told him about the baby and said, we prepare, as if preparing was something that could be done by a we, as if we was a word that applied to us. I said, were you ever going to tell me? He said, yes, when Voss was dealt with, when you were safe. When I could tell you without it being a thing you had to make a decision about in the middle of a dangerous situation. I said, that is still a choice you made for me. He said, yes, it is. He did not qualify it. He did not explain it further. He acknowledged it and let it sit, which was, I was learning, how he handled things he could not undo. He reached into his coat pocket and put the Pinkerton badge on the table beside the evidence box. He said, I am asking you, not as a necessity, not as a strategy, asking, will you testify to what you know? I looked at the badge. I looked at the box. I looked at him. I said, yes. We worked through the night. Not urgently, not with the frantic energy of people who have run out of time, but with the concentrated focus of two people who have a specific thing to build and know how to build it. Mac cleared the table and laid out the evidence box contents in order. The deed records, the witness statements, the Voss-Aldrich correspondence, the ledger page. And I sat across from him and read through each document in sequence, beginning to understand for the first time the full architecture of what he had constructed over 2 years. It was meticulous. The word is not strong enough, but it is the accurate one. Each document cross-referenced to at least 2 others. Each witness statement tied to a specific deed transfer record. The financial correspondence organized chronologically and annotated with references to the transactions they enabled. The whole thing built like a structure rather than assembled like a collection. Each piece load-bearing, each piece essential to the integrity of the whole. I said, you have been doing this work for 2 years alone. He said, yes. I said, without telling anyone. He said, Agnes knew something was going on. She is not a woman who misses things. But she did not know the specifics, and I did not give them to her because giving them to her would have put her at risk. I said, and the letter you left with her? He said, gives her enough to act on without giving her enough to be endangered by. The sealed packet contains references to the box contents and to Judge Stoddard, but nothing that would make Agnes specifically valuable to Voss as a source of information. He had thought about this. He had thought about all of it, not just the case, but the people adjacent to the case, the risks that could reach them through their connection to it, the ways those risks could be mitigated without eliminating them entirely. The kind of thinking that comes from years of working cases where other people's safety depended on what you did with what you knew. I drafted my sworn statement at the table by lamplight with Mac across from me working through the legal requirements. What a federal court needed from a first-hand witness, what level of specific detail was necessary, what needed to be stated directly rather than implied. He had been trained in this by 11 years of work and had not forgotten it, though he had not used it in 5 years, and the knowledge came back the way useful knowledge does. Not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony, just present and functional when the situation called for it. My statement covered my discovery of Thomas's operation in the spring of 1878, the specific documents I had found in his locked desk, the conversations I had heard, and what I understood them to indicate about Voss's role and Aldrich's involvement, the copy of the land sale agreement I had taken and was prepared to introduce as primary evidence, and my willingness to testify to all of it under oath in a federal court. Mac read the statement when I finished. He made 3 suggestions, specific phrases that would land more precisely in federal language, a clarification in the timeline that strengthened rather than weakened the sequence. I revised. He read again. He said, "This is sufficient, more than sufficient." I said, "And the 30-day trigger." He said, "Day 30 is in 4 days. If Agnes sends the packet when the trigger activates, Judge Stoddard will have the full evidence file and your sworn statement within 10 to 12 days of receiving it. He will move on it. I believe he will move on it. And a federal marshal will be dispatched to Copperhead Creek within 2 weeks of that," I said, "which means we need to hold Voss off for approximately 3 weeks from now." He said yes. I thought about this, about what holding Voss off meant practically, with the evidence we had and the position we were in, and Voss coming back in the morning with a forged murder warrant and 2 armed men. I said, "He's going to try to take you. The warrant gives him a legal mechanism. If he removes you from the equation, I have no protection." Mac said, "That is the calculation he has made, yes." I said, "So we need to change the calculation." He said, "Yes." We talked through the options, sending our own letter to Agnes immediately asking her to trigger early. But this required someone to carry it down the mountain, and neither of us could leave the cabin with Voss coming in the morning. Using the flares now, tonight, to bring someone up from the valley. But Agnes could not get up the mountain by morning, and arriving in Copperhead Creek by flare in the dark with a message that Voss was coming and bringing men would tell Voss's man in town, which was Pruitt, that we had called for help, which would accelerate Voss's timeline rather than extending it. What we needed was time. And the thing we had that Voss did not fully understand was the evidence in the box. Mac said, "He does not know what I have." I said, "He knows you were a Pinkerton. He knows you have been watching him. He thinks he has neutralized you with the murder warrant." Mac said, "Which means he will come tomorrow, expecting a man who has no options." I said, "And we will give him something he is not expecting." We worked out the plan in the small hours. My sworn statement read aloud in front of Pruitt, who was there as the official legal witness to the warrant, which meant he was also, technically, a witness to the response to it. Mac's evidence box opened and its contents identified on the record. A specific reference to Judge Stoddard and Helena and the correspondence Mac had with him, which established that someone outside Voss's reach already had knowledge of the case. And Agnes. Mac said, "Agnes has the letter. She has had it for 3 weeks. I said, "But the trigger is day 30. He said, "Agnes has the letter and the instructions. She also has her own judgment, which is considerable." He paused. "She knew something was going on when I left that letter with her. I did not tell her what, but Agnes does not need to be told things explicitly to understand them." I said, "You think she may have already sent it?" And he said, "I think Agnes Whitmore has been watching Harlan Voss operate in Copperhead Creek for 3 years and has had her own opinions about it, and that when Pruitt came through town asking questions about a woman staying on Blackthorn Ridge, she made certain calculations of her own. He said it with the particular quality of a man who trusts someone's judgment completely and has been deliberately not confirming that trust, because confirming it too explicitly would be a form of pressure. Near dawn, with the plan laid out and the documents in order, Mac looked at me across the table. He said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, if Voss does not respond the way we expect, if the evidence is not sufficient to hold him, if Pruitt decides that his employment is worth more to him than his legal obligations," I said, "then we deal with what actually happens rather than what we planned for." He said, "Yes." I said, "Mac." He looked at me. I said, "Why did you not leave? You have been building this case for 2 years. You could have built it from anywhere. Why stay on this specific mountain?" He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought he might not answer. He said, "At first, because Clara is buried on the east slope of this ridge. I was not willing to leave her." I said, "And after that?" He said, "Because I had decided that this was where I needed to be to do what I was doing. And because—" He stopped. I waited. He said, "Mom, because I was afraid that if I went back down the mountain, someone would eventually come up it, and I would not be able to make them leave, and I would not have finished what I was doing, and that would not be fair to them, or to the case, or to anyone." He looked at the table. He said, "And then you came up the mountain." I said, "And you were not finished." He said, "I am finished now." He reached across the table and took my hand, not with any particular ceremony, with the directness of a man who has decided that the distance between what he feels and what he expresses has been too large for too long. He said, "I should have told you sooner. About the case, about Agnes, about what I was doing here. I did not because I was afraid that if I told you, it would change what we were becoming before I understood what we were becoming. That was a wrong judgment, and it was mine to own." I said, "Yes?" He said, "I am asking you to stay. Not because of the case, not because of the baby. Because I want you to stay." He said it looking directly at me, which was how he said the things that were most real. I said, "I am not going anywhere, Cormac Driscoll. Not before tomorrow and not after it." He held my hand on the table. Outside, the first gray light of the false dawn was beginning to appear through the gaps in the shutters. The mountain was doing what it always did. Large, indifferent, entirely itself. And then, in the quiet of the false dawn, we heard hooves on the lower trail. Voss had decided not to wait for morning after all. Mac was on his feet. I picked up the rifle. We looked at each other across the table, across the evidence box, across the 5 months of accumulated knowing. That had brought us to this specific moment. He said, "Ready?" I said, "Yes." 4 riders. He had added a second hired gun overnight. They came out of the tree line with the unhurried deliberateness of men who have decided the outcome is already determined, and who are simply proceeding to its execution. Mac opened the cabin door before they reached the porch. He stepped outside with his hands loose at his sides and the Colt on his hip, not drawn. This was a performance of calm, deliberate, controlled. And I knew it was a performance not because it was false, but because everything Mac did in high-stakes situations was also a strategy. I stood in the doorway behind him. The second rifle was in my hands. I was 4.5 months pregnant, and I had been on this mountain for 5 months, and I had skinned rabbits and faced down a blizzard, and watched a man I had come to love tell me the truth about himself, even when the telling cost him. And I was not afraid of Harlan Voss in a way that was going to change anything I did. Voss dismounted. He was smiling. The smile was the same as yesterday's. Practiced, specific, covering something underneath it that was calculating rather than warm. He said, "Good morning, Mr. Driscoll. I had hoped we might resolve our business before the day got much further along." Mac said, "Come inside." Voss's certainty flickered for perhaps half a second. He had expected resistance or capitulation or something dramatic. Come inside was not one of his expected responses. He followed Mac in, Pruitt behind him. The two hired guns stayed in the clearing. Mac had positioned himself so that they could see him through the open door, which meant they could also see that his hands were empty. This was deliberate. Inside, I was standing at the table. The evidence box was open. My sworn statement was in my hand. Voss saw the box. He saw the documents laid out across the table. He saw my statement. The smile did not leave his face, but the certainty behind it shifted, became harder, more analytical, reassessing. I said, "Deputy Pruitt, you are here as the legal witness to the warrant you have produced against Mr. Driscoll. As a legal witness, you are required to observe and record any response to that warrant. I am going to read my sworn statement into the record. Please attend carefully." Pruitt looked at Voss. Voss's face told him nothing useful. I read the statement. I read all of it. Every parcel number. Every transaction date. Every name. Voss's name, Aldrich's name, the name of the Territorial Land Office contact who had been accepting payments for altered records. My specific testimony about Thomas's role, the instructions he had received, the documents I had personally seen and handled, the copy of the land sale agreement, which I held up as I described it, the 3 copies I had made, their current locations, the means by which they could be retrieved and authenticated, and at the end the name of Federal Circuit Judge Harlan P. Stoddard in Helena, and the fact that a sealed evidence packet had been in the possession of Agnes Whitmore of Copperhead Creek for the past 3 weeks, with instructions to deliver it to Judge Stoddard's office if a specific condition was not met. I said, "That condition has not been met." The cabin was absolutely silent. Then Voss said, "That document is the fabrication of a woman with a financial interest in avoiding her late husband's debts, and anything derived from it." Mac said, "The document is one of 11 primary exhibits in a federal evidence file that has been in preparation for 2 years. The other 10 exhibits are on this table. The file has been described in correspondence with Judge Stoddard. The correspondence is in the box." He paused. "Pruitt, you are a legal officer of this territory. Look at the material on this table and tell me what you think a federal court will make of it." Pruitt looked at the table. He had the expression of a man doing a rapid and unwelcome calculation. Voss said, This does not change the validity of the federal warrant, Driscoll. You are still," Mac said. "The warrant names Robert Fenwick as a Pinkerton operative killed in Fremont County in October of 1873. My Pinkerton service record, which is in the box, shows that I was in Billings in October of 1873 attending my sister's funeral. I have 3 dated letters from that period establishing my presence in Billings. Robert Fenwick retired from the Pinkerton Agency in 1871 and was living in St. Louis in 1873. The warrant is a forgery, and a federal examination will establish that within the week." Voss said, "You cannot." He stopped. Because at that moment from outside came the sound of horses, multiple horses, moving at a pace that meant purpose, coming from the direction of Copperhead Creek. Mac had not moved from where he stood, and his face showed nothing that looked like surprise, which told me everything about whether this had been anticipated. Agnes Whitmore rode into the clearing on her large roan mule, which she rode the way she did everything, with the complete authority of a person who has decided what they are doing and does not require anyone's opinion about it. Behind her came 2 men I did not recognize, and one I identified by the federal marshal's badge on his coat before I could see his face clearly. He was a broad-shouldered man of about 50, with the weathered look of someone who had spent his career outdoors, and the particular economy of movement that experienced law officers develop. He rode directly to the front of the cabin and looked at the scene in front of him. Voss, Pruitt, the 2 hired guns in the clearing, Mac in the doorway. And his face registered none of it as surprising. He said, "Marshal Thomas Calloway, Federal Circuit Court, District of Montana. I am looking for Harlan Voss." Voss said, "This is—" He stopped. He looked at the marshal. He looked at Mac. He looked at the evidence box on the table behind me. The hired gun on the left side of the clearing made a small movement with his right hand. One of the marshal's men said, "Keep your hands where I can see them, son." The hand stopped. Pruitt took his revolver from his holster and set it on the floor of the cabin. He set it down carefully with the intentionality of a man who has made a decision about which way to fall and wants it noted. Voss said nothing. He was a man who had spent his life in rooms where he had the advantage, and he was in a room where he did not have it, and he was old enough and experienced enough to understand what that meant. Mac stepped aside from the doorway. The marshal came in. He looked at the evidence box and the documents and my sworn statement and the Pinkerton badge that was still on the table where Mac had placed it. He said, "Is this the file Mrs. Whitmore's packet references?" Mac said, "Yes." The marshal looked through the top layer of documents for approximately 3 minutes. Then he looked at Mac and said, "I received the packet 4 days ago. I left Helena the following morning." He paused. "Mrs. Whitmore sent it 11 days ahead of the trigger date." Mac said, "I know." Agnes, from the doorway of the cabin where she had positioned herself with the air of someone who has arrived at a conclusion she has been working toward for some time, said, "I sent it the day after Pruitt came through town asking about a woman on Blackthorn Ridge. Because I have been watching Harlan Voss operate in this valley for 3 years, and I am not a patient woman where injustice is concerned." She looked at me when she said it, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had made a decision about another woman's situation and had chosen to trust it, and who was satisfied with that choice. The marshal arrested Voss in the clearing of Blackthorn Ridge at approximately 7:15 in the morning on a Tuesday in April of 1879, with the sun coming up over the eastern mountains and the spruce tops catching the first real warmth of the spring. Pruitt was taken into custody as a cooperative witness. The marshal was specific about the distinction, and Pruitt was specific about accepting it. The 2 hired guns were disarmed and released, as they had no knowledge of the fraud and had committed no crime beyond standing in a clearing with their hands near their weapons. Voss said nothing as they led him away. He looked at me once, with the expression of a man doing arithmetic, and I looked back at him with nothing in my face that gave him anything to work with. Agnes Whitmore came inside the cabin and put her arms around me, and she held on for a long time without saying anything. And then she stepped back and looked at me at arm's length, and her expression was all the things she did not need to say. She looked at Mac. She said, "You are the most aggravating man I have encountered in 40 years of boarding lodge management. You let that woman carry around a copy of a fraudulent land contract in a dead man's coat pocket for 5 months without telling her it was the piece you needed." Mac said, "I told her." Agnes said, "You told her eventually. There is a difference between eventually and appropriately." She paused. "But I suppose the outcome is the same, so I will not belabor it." She looked at the evidence box. "Is that everything?" Mac said, "That is everything." Agnes nodded. She sat down at the table, picked up the nearest document, and began to read through it with the focused attention of a woman who had made herself a stakeholder in this outcome and intended to understand it fully. Mac came and stood beside me. He put his hand on the back of my neck, careful, warm. He said very quietly, "It is done." I leaned back against him, and I felt the steadiness of him that was real and had always been real. And I thought, yes, it is. The legal process that followed was not simple and was not fast, but it was thorough. The federal investigation, anchored by the evidence box and my sworn testimony, took 8 months to complete. Voss was held in federal custody in Helena for the duration. Commissioner Aldrich was removed from office and charged with conspiracy and bribery within the first month. The Territorial Land Office contact resigned before he could be formally charged and provided extensive testimony in exchange for a reduction in his exposure, which was how federal cases usually went. The 11 Montana families and 7 Wyoming families whose land titles were fraudulent had their cases adjudicated through the federal court. The process of reversing the fraudulent transactions and reinstating their legal title took until late in the following year, but it was done. Each family received written confirmation of their title and a formal apology from the territorial government, which was not nothing, though it was not as much as it should have been. Mac was formally cleared of all charges. The murder warrant was examined by 3 federal attorneys and determined to be a forgery within 4 days of its submission to the court. His Pinkerton service record was officially restored with a notation that his resignation had been the result of a principled objection, and that the agency's official position on his departure was revised. He received a letter from the agency's national director offering reinstatement. He wrote back declining in a letter that was 3 sentences long and completely courteous, and left no ambiguity about the finality of the decision. Agnes said when she heard about it, "Good. You are better suited to this." Mac said, "To what specifically?" Agnes said, "To being a person rather than an instrument." She was right, as she generally was. Clara Margaret Driscoll came into the world on a Tuesday in December just after midnight in the second room Mac had built on the south side of the cabin. Agnes was there. She had arrived in late November with her bag and her opinions and a bottle of brandy she declared was medicinal and that I chose not to dispute. She had delivered children on the frontier for 20 years, and she brought to the process all the knowledge and none of the drama of someone who understood exactly what she was doing and why each part of it mattered. The labor was long, longer than the books had suggested it would be, longer than I had prepared myself for, though I had tried to prepare myself honestly rather than optimistically, which had been the right approach, even if it had not been sufficient. Mac stayed in the room the entire time. He held my hand when I needed it held, and did not hold it when I needed both hands for other purposes, and he said very little, which was correct, because what I needed was not narration but presence, and presence was the thing he had always been best at. Agnes said at approximately 1:30 in the morning, "There she is," and she put a small, red-faced, aggressively outraged person in my arms, and I looked down at her, and something happened in my chest that I do not have adequate language for even now. She was real. After all the months of being a future thing, a consequence, a condition requiring preparation, she was a specific person, furious at the indignity of her arrival, making this known loudly and without any interest in the hour. Mac sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her. Agnes, satisfied with the immediate situation, moved efficiently through the things that needed doing next. Mac watched his daughter with an expression I can only describe as the expression of a man who has been presented with evidence that changes his entire understanding of a subject he thought he understood. He said, "She is so small." I said, "She is very loud for how small she is." He said, "She has your jaw." I said, "She has your forehead." He said, "Poor child." Agnes from across the room, "Both of you be quiet and let her settle." We named her Clara for his sister and Margaret for my mother, and she could choose which she preferred when she was old enough to have opinions about it. In the meantime, she was Clara, which fit her in the particular way that names sometimes fit people. Not because of what the name means, but because of who had it before. The year that followed was the hardest and the best of my life, which is not a contradiction. Clara was demanding in the way that all new people are demanding, comprehensively, without schedule, with complete indifference to the needs of the people around her, which is appropriate for a person who has only recently arrived and has not yet been informed that other people have needs. Mac adapted to this with the same systematic patience he applied to everything else that required learning. He read the child-rearing sections of every book we had with the same focused attention he had given to the evidence file. He was methodical about it, and he was wrong about some things, and he learned from being wrong without requiring the wrongness to be a significant event. He was, as I had told him he would be, good at it. He carried Clara in a canvas sling he fashioned himself from the material he used for supply pack linings, adjusted until it fitted correctly, and held her securely against his chest, and he walked the clearing with her in the mornings when she would not sleep, talking to her in the low, steady voice he used for things he was serious about. He told her about the mountain, about the timber and the trap lines and the way weather announced itself in the spruce tops before it arrived at ground level. He told her about Clara, his sister, who would have wanted to know her. He told her on a morning I was watching from the cabin window without his knowledge that her mother was the stubbornest and most capable person he had ever known, and that she should take that as a model for how to exist in the world. I did not tell him I had heard this. Some things you hold privately, as I said. Voss received 7 years in federal prison. Aldrich received 5 years and a lifetime bar from public office. The Territorial Land Office contact received 18 months in exchange for his testimony, which a number of people considered insufficient, and which I had no energy to have a position about, because the energy required to hold positions about the insufficiency of other people's punishments is energy that could be used for other things. Agnes visited every month, without exception. She came up the switchback on her roan mule with her bag and her opinions, and occasionally the strong coffee she knew we could not get easily on the mountain, and she stayed 3 days and went home. Clara reached for her whenever she came through the door. Agnes accepted this with the expression of a woman who is deeply moved by something and has decided not to make a production of it. The mountain did what it always did. It was large and indifferent and entirely itself, and it required every single day more than most places require of the people who live in them. The winters were long and the work was real, and there were mornings when I sat at the table in the early dark before Mac was up and Clara was still sleeping, and I looked out at the timber and understood, as I had understood on the day I burned the debt notice on the Billings platform, that life rarely gives you what you wanted. It gives you what you are willing to work toward. These are different things, and the difference between them is the difference between a life that is bearable and one that is yours. Spring came to Blackthorn Ridge in late March of the following year, and we sat on the porch that Mac had added to the south side of the cabin. A proper porch with a rail and a section of roof and 2 chairs built during the previous autumn, and watched the valley below show the first green along the creek line. And Clara sat in Mac's lap and pointed at things and made sounds that were not quite words yet but were clearly intended as words. The particular determined babbling of a person who has noticed that the people around her communicate in a specific system and who is resolved to master it. Mac said, "She is going to be verbal." I said, "I had noticed." He said, "You are also verbal." I said, "Is that a complaint?" He said, "No." He put his arm around my shoulders and I leaned against him, and Clara pointed at a hawk working the thermals above the valley and said something emphatic that none of us could identify, but that seemed to satisfy her. I thought about a platform in Billings and a burning piece of paper and $14, and a woman named Agnes who had poured coffee before I asked for it and told me the truth about what I was walking into without trying to prevent me from walking into it. I thought about 7 women who had come up this trail and gone back down, and about what Agnes had said, not cruel, just used up, and about how wrong that description had turned out to be, or rather how accurately it had described a temporary condition rather than a permanent character, which is a distinction that matters enormously. I thought about Thomas Callahan, who had been charming and dishonest, and who had cost more people more than he ever intended to account for, and about Harlan Voss, who had been none of those things, who had known exactly what he was doing and had done it deliberately and without the excuse of charm, and about the 11 families in this valley who were living on their own land now because a woman had walked up a mountain in a blizzard with a coat she had not had time to go through and a copy of a fraudulent contract in its inner pocket. Contingency. The word for when the small accidental things become the hinges on which large things turn. I thought about Mac building this case for 2 years in a cabin on a mountain ridge, alone, going down to Copperhead Creek for supplies, and coming back with witness statements and financial correspondence, and a patience that most people would have found impossible to sustain. I thought about him letting Thomas go in Wyoming because he believed the man was trying to make things right, which was the wrong judgment about a specific man, and the right judgment about a principle, and about how those 2 things can both be true simultaneously, and about how the wrong judgment had led, through a chain of events that no one could have planned, to 11 families getting their land back and a woman from County Cork finding a place on a Montana mountain that was genuinely hers. Contingency. and also the specific character of the people involved, which was not contingent at all. Mac said, "What are you thinking about?" I said, "The sequence of events that led to this specific moment." He said, "And?" I said, "And I think it required everyone to be exactly who they were. Agnes had to be Agnes. You had to be you. I had to be—" I paused. I said, "I had to be stubborn enough to put my boot in the door." He said, "You did that." I said, "You could have closed the door anyway." He said, "I considered it." I said, "What stopped you?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The last 4 words you used. I need to disappear for a winter." He looked at the valley below. I had heard the others say variations of that. I need somewhere safe. I need somewhere quiet. I need a fresh start. He paused. Disappear was specific. Disappear meant you understood what this place actually was. Not a refuge, not a retreat, a disappearance, something more serious. I said, "And that made me different from the others." He said, "That made me curious about you, which is where it starts for me. Curiosity." Clara made a definitive sound and patted his arm with her small hand, which he interpreted correctly as a request for his attention and gave her. I looked at the valley and the mountains beyond it, and the sky above that, which was the deep, enduring blue of a Montana late morning in March, a color that has no equivalent anywhere I have been, and that I have come to think of as the color of this specific life. Clear and cold and vast and entirely uncompromisingly real. 7 women left Blackthorn Ridge. I have thought about them over the years. I do not know all their stories, and I do not judge the ones I know. The woman who lasted 9 days, who came back down crying because she had been given nothing but orders and silence. She was right to leave. The woman who lasted 3 weeks, and left because of the way he looked at her like she was already gone. She was reading something accurate, though the thing she was reading was not about her but about him. And him at a specific moment in a specific condition that was not permanent, but that she had no reason to know was not permanent. They were right about what they experienced. They were right to make the decisions they made. The mountain that broke them was the same mountain. The man that wore them down was the same man. I am not here because I was stronger or braver or more suited to difficulty. I am here because I ran out of road at exactly the moment when the thing I was running toward happened to be waiting at the end of it. I am here because I had a coat I had not gone through the pockets of, and a piece of paper in one of those pockets, and a woman named Agnes who gave me directions rather than discouragement. I am here because Mac Driscoll had been building a case for 2 years that needed exactly the witness I turned out to be, and because the same man who built that case was capable, under the right circumstances, of being the kind of person whose hands are gentle when they are binding a wound. I am here because I stopped running. Not because I found courage, though I found some. Not because the fear went away, though it diminished, but because at a certain point the thing I was moving toward became more real to me than the thing I was moving away from. And once that happens, the direction changes, whether you plan it or not. Mac said, in the particular quiet voice he used for the things he most meant, "I am glad you came up the mountain." I said, "So am I." Clara said something emphatic and pointed at the hawk again, which had reappeared above the valley on a different thermal, working the morning air with the patient efficiency of something that knows exactly what it is doing and needs no one's permission to do it. Mac said, "Hawk." Clara said, "Ha!" Mac said, "Close enough." The mountain was what it always was. The work was what it always was. The morning light came down through the spruce tops and fell across the clearing and the porch, and the 3 of us sitting there in it, and the valley below was green along the creek and white above the tree line and entirely, overwhelmingly itself. This is what I know now, looking back from the distance of years, from the particular vantage point of a life that was built rather than inherited or stumbled into or endured. Home is not a place you find. Everyone says this, and everyone is right. But knowing it does not make it easier to believe until you have experienced the proof of it, until you have found something that felt like home and understood that what made it feel that way was not the structure or the landscape, but the accumulated weight of everything that happened inside it. The choosing and the staying and the working and the fighting and the making of things that endure. We built this. With our hands and our patience and our individual stubborn refusal to let the hard parts make us into smaller people than we were capable of being. We built it on a mountain in Montana in the winter of 1878, when we had almost nothing useful to work with, and we built it into something that holds. Not perfectly. Nothing holds perfectly. The winters are still long and the work still never fully ends. And there are mornings when the cold comes in under the door, and I understand completely why 7 women came down this mountain rather than staying on it. There are mornings when Mac disappears into a silence that is longer than usual, and I have learned to leave him space inside it rather than filling it. And there are evenings when I need something he does not naturally think to give, and I have learned to say so directly rather than waiting to see if he notices. We are not a perfect thing, we are a real one. And Clara is pointing at the hawk and saying, "Ha!" And Mac is saying, "Close enough," and the morning light is doing what it does, and the mountain is being what it is, and I am sitting on a porch on Blackthorn Ridge in Montana Territory in the spring of 1880, and I am home. I am entirely, completely, permanently home. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.
As a writer who has spent many years telling stories of the American West, stories shaped by hardship, silence, and the quiet strength of those who endure, I would say that this story carries a meaning far deeper than survival alone. It is, at its heart, a story about responsibility, redemption, and the courage to choose differently when life gives you no easy road. The journey of Eleanor Callahan teaches us that our past does not define us, but our choices in the face of that past do. She begins as a woman burdened by fear, guilt, and silence, someone who once knew the truth yet chose not to act. That silence becomes her heaviest weight. But the story does not condemn her. Instead, it shows that moral courage is not always immediate. Sometimes it comes later, forged through hardship, reflection, and the refusal to keep running. When Eleanor finally decides to face the truth and testify, she transforms from a passive witness into an agent of justice. The lesson here is clear. It is never too late to do what is right, but the cost of delay is something we must be willing to carry. Cormac Driscoll represents another side of moral complexity. He is a man shaped by a past mistake, one act of mercy that led to greater harm. Yet instead of turning away from that failure, he dedicates years of his life to correcting it. His story reminds us that good intentions are not enough. Responsibility does not end with a decision. We are accountable not only for what we do, but for the consequences that follow. Still, the story offers grace. Even when we are wrong, we can choose to make things right. Redemption is not found in perfection, but in persistence. Together, Eleanor and Cormac show that trust is not built through grand gestures, but through small, consistent acts, hard work, honesty, and quiet care. In a harsh environment where survival depends on reliability, they learn that love is not about escape or fantasy, but about standing beside someone and facing reality together. This is a powerful moral truth. Real relationships are not formed in comfort, but in endurance. Finally, the story speaks about home. It rejects the idea that home is something we find ready-made. Instead, it argues that home is something we build through choices, through responsibility, and through the willingness to stay when leaving would be easier. Eleanor does not find safety by running away. She finds it by stopping, confronting the truth, and creating something new with her own hands. So the lesson of this story is not simple, but it is profound. Life will rarely give us a clean beginning or a fair chance. But we are defined by what we do with what we are given, by whether we choose silence or truth, escape or responsibility, fear or courage. And in choosing rightly, even imperfectly, we can build a life that is truly our own.